fantastic. Welcome to part two. No pressure, Pat, but that's going to be hard to follow. And I was going to say the last time I saw you, you were playing in Nando's, but that wasn't the last time I saw you. When the Elfin Hotel.
The Elfin Hotel.
Yeah.
I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah.
There's actually two people here who were there at those gigs.
Yeah,
Yes.
they were great, and you know, to me as someone who was young, who loved music, like being able to see you in the Elfin Hotel and walk home was a really big deal. You know, that you could see a band that were going to get a record deal, that were making music that you wanted to hear. So Pat O'Donnell from the Fountainhead, and then this amazing post-band career of mentoring and engineering and producing bands. So you know, I interviewed Kieran Ohms, who managed the Prunes as well as the Fountainhead, and I spoke to your bandmate, Steve at length.
Cullen.
Yeah, so I've a good interview with both of them, and we've had a chat before, but you were there when music completely changed and when the audience for music completely changed. So, you know, I'd love to capture that. So again, like Trevor, did you grow up with music? You know, were you listening to music as a young person?
Oh yeah, absolutely. But yes, the change. There were a lot of changes in the 70s, I think. You know, for me, I suppose I should start. My history was, I grew up in America, Irish parents. They met in London in the 60s. Sorry, 50s, late 50s. And I was born in late 60 and spent the next 10 years growing up in America. So my earliest memories of the radio were, I remember a little bit of The Summer of Love from my early childhood. But then coming back to, then they moved to London they were there for a few years before finally returning back to Dunleary, which was the big move back home. And I remember our uncle's family came back to, all the O'Donnells came back to Dunleary around 71, 72. So then I remember the next phase, to get up to your question, was, I remember it was the Top of the Pops era. The next thing was growing up glam rock and being a kid watching Top of the Pops with my parents, and you know, and I remember Waterloo and what was that? Bohemian Rhapsody, being at #1 for like 12 weeks or something, you know. So there was all that. But then like other kids, I got a Spanish guitar for Christmas one year, and then I had an older brother who was, my mum had some previous marriages, and I had an older brother whose father died, and he came to live with us, and he brought me over. He was a bit older, and he'd listened to the Stones and all that, and he brought me over a guitar. So I got my first guitar. So I was 12 or 13, learning, you know, American Pie and the likes, you know, and where the House of the Rising Sun, I think, was a big one for all of us. So that got us up to, and then we're up to school, finishing school. Then through the 70s, getting into the more serious stuff, you know, Dark Side of the Moon and Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix, and getting into grown-up music and moving beyond Top of the Pops, and then the big change is the one you mentioned, was towards the end of the 70s, was when punk happened, which led to new wave. And initially, I think for people over here, we were a bit behind London. It took us a while to get our heads around it, and I think it interested me. And around this time, I met Steve, my partner from the Fountainhead, you know, around sort of late 70s, early 80s in Dunleary. He was a musician too, and very like Trevor, would have played in some local bands, but I think then what happened was the first thing, I think the thing that really got the Fountainhead started, and again, there was that just the post-punk when things really started opening up. And there was, you know, electronics were coming. I think technology probably shaped the next phase. You know, so we're heading into the 80s. So we had the new attitude from punk. You know, that you know, finally people were throwing out their Dark Side of the Moons and buying Clash records or you know. But I think it really interested us when it got a little bit more. It grew from that, and we heard bands like The Cure and XTC, and then, you know, the first electronic album I remember was probably The Human League and Depeche Mode. There was that, so that was the exciting stuff for us. I think it was around that stage it grabbed us. So how it affected us was myself and Steve were now friends living in a house in Laoghaire. We had a mutual friend, a guy called Conor Murray, who was a big part in our getting started. He had the most amazing record collection. I remember he had all this experimental, you know, he had all the krautrock. He got us into Can, I remember, and bands like that. Funny enough, to me, hearing them, they were like a new band to me around then, even though they were an experimental 70s band. So around that time, it was all these influences coming in, but I think what set us going was, I think we were at the very early stage of DIY recording, and you know, where big studios were super expensive and unobtainable for. I think we got our first 4-track in like 1980 and brought that home, and that's kind of in a way what started the band.
Okay, and that's really important. So where did you get the 4-track?
So Steve had a part-time job fixing. He was good at electronics and that little DIY thing. I remember he was working somewhere. Someone traded in this big 4-track reel-to-reel. I think someone bought it and didn't know how to use it or something. So Steve came home with a 4-track one day. Actually, Conor was part of that too. And then I went to London, I remember, with an old suitcase, brought home our first synth, plugged that in. Then we got an electronics magazine, and Steve being good at electronics, we built our first drum machine. So we were off. We had a drum machine, a synth, and a 4-track in a little house in Laoghaire. And it was just exciting, you know, it was an exciting time.
Oh no, it's beyond exciting.
Yeah.
So, and just a bit of context on Steve, you know, so he was able to build a drum machine, but he also built his first guitar.
Oh, he did.
Out of a block of wood. And I think when he had finished it, like he, you know, it was a magazine, an electronics magazine, because his dad was electronic, you know, was handy in that way as well. And I think when he had built the guitar, he realized that you couldn't actually lift it because the wood was so heavy, but he'd done a great job. So I love that you've made the link, and I hadn't thought of that before, between the DIY of punk, which was anyone can play a guitar and you know, make a racket and shout, and some of them were great players, kind of pretended that they weren't. But suddenly the availability of electronic equipment for people who were tuned into that.
It was the beginning of home recording, I would say, other than maybe before that you might have had a 2-track tape recorder or a cassette machine in a rehearsal room. But this was the first chance that people had of multi-track recording at home.
And you're at the forefront of that. You're one of the first 4-tracks that exists in Ireland, and
I think it was before the little, what came out was the Tascam Porta Studio that a lot of people bought in the early 80s. So it was about a year or two before the Porta Studio.
Yeah, and there's 2 lads in Laoghaire with us. It's like building a rocket ship. and like, did you know how to use it? Because they didn't come with manuals, you know, the technical manuals, but not how to make music with it. Like, how did you figure it out?
I actually don't know. It was just, I think it was, you'd hear something. I think it was probably from listening to other experimental music. Bands like Can, who experimented, and some early electronic sort of indie stuff from the UK. And I I remember getting a few of those early compilation albums, bands like the Geordie Column, and you know, early experimental. Yeah, Andy Partridge from XTC was doing a lot of stuff on the side with kind of, you know, backward sounds, and I think it was just that the interest in experimental music
and that comes across
the DIY thing.
Yeah, that comes across really well in your body of work, which stands the test of time. Like, your records still sound really good.
Most of it.
Most of it. No, the vast majority of it does. You were I don't know that at the start you were trying to write 3-minute pop songs. Were you playing with what the technology could do and kind of seeing where it led?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, see, there is a, you know, it's the whole thing about, in hindsight, you'd look back, and in some ways I wish we'd stuck a little closer, but as the years go on and we started gigging, our first way of gigging then, the only way we could do it was by making backing tapes. So we used to put drums and bass, or try to program our drum box and bass lines and stuff on a reel-to-reel, and we'd gig as a two-piece, playing over. So that was a way of doing it live, and that built up a you know, something in Dublin. We got it, and then we actually got our name. We were just Pat and Steve,
yeah,
up to about 82 or 3. And then our manager, actually, Kieran Owens, who you interviewed, picked the name. And so, because we would have been Pat and Steve forever.
Yeah, and
from Dunleary.
Yeah, Pat and Steve from Dunleary. Like, you're going to write that on the back of your denim jacket. Now, yeah, so you'd such a bad band name, because it wasn't just Pat and Steve from Dunleary, it was, you know, Steve Belton and Pat O'Donnell. So it sounded like two lads from Kerry. You know,
most people got it wrong. I'm still called Steve.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
So you're doing this ultra modern music, and there isn't really a synth rock scene when you start in Dublin. Now, more bands did come on board, but you were very much pioneers. You're innovators. You get Kieran Owens on board, who was the manager of the Virgin Prunes, which wouldn't have been the easiest job.
We did one thing together.
Yeah.
He got us together once. They had a warehouse opposite the Project Arts, and we brought our 4-track in, and we did a little bit of recording with them. And I think one of the songs, we just didn't have enough tracks. They had so many layers they wanted, but it was an experience, and it was a good one too. And they were one of the other bands that would have been very experimental, maybe in a different way, in a more art focused way. But yeah, they were down. And there was a guy called Stano, if anyone remembers Stano. I remember in the project, so we were fans of his too.
I wrote the sleeve notes for Stano's album, just for the nerds out there. No, and that to me is really important. You know, the first time I saw your name, to be honest, was on a Virgin Prunes record on the New Form of Beauty, and it was
one of those.
How's there a guy from Dunleary in with those weirdos from the north side? Because I went to every Prunes gig, and I never knew what was going to happen.
Were you at the Douglas Hyde one in about 1983, where they had the art exhibition?
Okay.
Remember that one?
Yeah. Not only was I there, but
that was a spectacular gig. Yeah.
It was obnoxious on every level. But here's a funny story. Because the Virgin Prunes realised that they hadn't met their target audience in Ireland, because half the people who went to see the Prunes wanted to kick the shit out of them. So it was all the lads from the squat up in Leeson Street who hated them, but they paid their $3.50 in the hope that they could beat them up during the gig or after. It made no difference. So it was very, very heavy. You know, we were talking about this a little bit earlier about the Dublin scene was really, really heavy. Like, when you went to a gig, there was a good chance that something bad would happen to you. and the Prunes were very confrontational, but they were also incredible. But
The Advance record. Do you mean the Advance? Remember the Advance records at the top of?
oh,
Yeah.
yeah, so Advance Records
yeah.
up at the Stephen's Green was kind of the epicenter where the punks would meet.
And Skinheads.
Punks, skinheads, mods, anyone who wanted, with a death wish, you'd go there to buy your Dorothy column records. But the Virgin Prunes, they did 2 shows in the Douglas Hyde, that one, and they did an exhibition. But they thought, we need to do an all ages show for the kids. Because the kids, they don't get a chance to see, blokes in dresses waving a pig's head, because Gavin worked in an abattoir. And for any of you who don't work in an abattoir, there's a really, really good fringe benefit in that you can take the pig's heads home, because no one was using them. Like, it was before that, the new cuisine where you use all of the animal. So they were doing the all ages show in the afternoon, and I bought the only ticket for it. So they cancelled it, and the Comsat Angels were playing the same day in McGonagall's. So I thought I have to see the Prunes, because I can't miss a Prunes gig. But you remember those bands. So you remember the Prunes. Stano was outrageous in what he did.
He used to use film. He was one of the first guys I saw using film on stage in the project around that time. There was another guy we were working with, mind you. There was another, which Kieran also introduced us, was a guy called Nigel Roth. And we did we did most of his, he wanted to start getting into mixed media and sort of, I remember he was very influenced by Laurie Anderson, and she was doing stuff, mixing, performance with music and film and stuff. So he got us to do his first couple, and that was very enjoyable collaboration. It was just really exciting. But yeah, he's an interesting guy.
Yeah, and that was, as a fan, Pirate Radio and John Peel now were more important to me than, no offense, Fab Vinny or Larry Gogan. So I was always looking for something that was just a little bit outside my comfort zone.
Yeah.
And your name kept cropping up with those bands, or sometimes on bills, and as I mentioned, working with the Prunes. Who else impressed you? Who do you remember from that era? Either Irish bands or bands like the Dorothy column?
Well, yeah, I think it was I think around the time it started to get exciting. There was maybe a thing with punk at first, where after listening to Pink Floyd for a few years, it took me a while to, what's going on. It was when I started hearing bands like The Cure or XTC, and I just started hearing all those great, Joy Division, New Order, and then I guess for us there was a little bit of a similarity, and we weren't purely electronic. We were mixing guitars, but with synths, and it was when it went into that direction, I think it started getting exciting, and that's something I could do, or but and also circumstantial. I suppose whatever age I was at, you finish school, and the idea of making a living at music, didn't seem. So it was around that time, I think, maybe I can do this. Maybe there is a chance of, maybe I don't have to get a real job, and maybe there's a chance of I can make a living playing music. And I guess from there on is where it led to us gigging, and then from there, with all those influences, and then I guess what happened then into the 80s was, whether we realized it or not, our stuff was probably getting a little bit more commercial. And we did get a record deal in 1985, but going back to your earlier question, in hindsight, in a way, I prefer some of our earlier, the more experimental nature to what we did when we're, in saying that, they were happy days, and they were great times. And I like all the Fountainhead catalog, and it's easy to say in hindsight, but I always admired bands like New Order that I think really stuck to their, they didn't, they stuck to their guns. artistically, you know, and I don't think we were really strongly influenced by the record company,
Yeah.
but a bit of it comes into play that you're like, they picked the producer for our first album.
Okay.
So the sound of it, you know, we were excited then, but maybe it was a little more commercial than I would have liked, you know, but
Yeah,
you become part of it, you know.
but to me, I can hear that tension on your records. That tension between people who just thought, we're just going to do something really weird and interesting and fun and innovative, and then, you know, the more structured side. Like I think they both exist in you know, before you signed
Yeah.
to China Records. But the other amazing thing about this band is that you opened for some of the most important bands that visited Ireland at the time, and you competed with them. Like, it didn't feel like, oh, there's the Irish lads, you know, when's the real band coming on? So, you know, Kieran was well liked. He was a great networker. It was the time when Dennis Desmond was beginning to bring more bands, and they were finding an audience. You played on that incredible, now I wasn't at it, but it was probably one of the greatest gigs that ever took place in this country, and it was the U2, Big Country, Simple Minds,
Felix Park.
Eurythmics, the band from Northern Ireland who came down.
Steel Pulse were on it, I think.
Steel Pulse were on it, and A Perfect Crime,
Yeah.
and then you opened it, and because it was Dublin, a huge crowd in Phoenix Park, and there was a helicopter filming it. So what do your parents, not you, you decided, hey, wouldn't it be really, really cool if we tried to pull the helicopter out of the sky into the audience? And then the other thing that your parents did, Eve, it's funny being saying this to my students, you know, I tell them how bad their parents were, but now one of their parents is here, so I have to be careful what I say. And Annie Lennox broke down at the gig because there was a bunch of people shouting, "Go back to England, you bitch!" And she broke, you know, and she broke down in tears and said, "I'm from Scotland." So anytime there was a great gig in Ireland, you would just kick off. You know, you try and wreck something. But who else did you open for, and who impressed you live?
Actually, that up to the point of getting the record deal, yeah, those early 80s, we got a lot of supports. And actually MCD, they were only a smaller company, but I actually think some of it was practical. There was only two of us, and a tape recorder. So the engineers in the bands we were supporting loved us. No drum kit, no bass amp, you know, just we had a very streamlined. So, but the ones I remember were Depeche Mode and the SFX. I think we did that. We supported them, Belfast. A few people, Nick Kershaw. Yeah, so, but you know what? They were the nicest guys, and it was fun. Who else was over around that time? Stadium. Oh, and then of course Queen at Slane.
Yeah.
We opened up for it was Fountainhead, the Bangles.
The Bangles were on that. Yeah.
Chris Rea.
Yeah.
And Queen.
So how was that?
And
yeah.
That was
Because we're in Dunleary, how was it opening for Queen? I'll just ask you that.
Well, I was more interested in the Bangles personally.
Yeah.
Yeah. And especially the lead singer at the time. But anyway, they we didn't meet Freddie.
No.
They came in on a helicopter. I remember it was a grey, rainy day,
Right.
and funny enough, it didn't go down as one of the most famous or talked about slang gigs ever, like Springsteen or Dylan or something.
Yeah.
But yes, we got good press from it, and it was an experience. It was kind of terrifying. I remember, and it seemed to go. Was the fastest, half an hour of my life. It was kind of. But it was great. It did us good, and it was very, very. That was of '86, so our first album was out,
Right.
and that was a good year. Yeah, we were very excited about the whole thing.
And am I correct in saying by then you were a band?
We were
It
a
wasn't
band.
just a two. So how did you go from being a two-piece where there was a real kind of a sonic integrity about you?
Yeah, when we signed to China, I guess we sort of, they signed The Art of Noise around the same time, and I guess we saw ourselves as a little bit one of those 80s, slightly electronic, you know, using technology and stuff. But when we got the record deal, we had some money. It was the first time we had a little bit of, no, not lots. Some people used to think getting a record deal that your life was sorted. But anyway, we had some, so we put a band together at the time, and it wasn't a pool of session musicians. It was a smaller thing, so we had to look. I remember there was a kind of a touring band called Kathmandu from the north, and they were always kind of the most super duper. They used to do cover versions of Roxy Music and Bowie and make them sound better than the originals. They were just that. So we got in touch with Peter and Trevor. Okay. Trevor later ended up with the Water Boys. And then when I got into my production area, Peter ended up being the drummer in The Four of Us, which is a band that I produced and wrote with later on. And so it's a small country. But anyway, yeah, so we looked from the pool of people around. Probably not big enough to be going to London, and you know, we used, and then our bass player was actually an old friend from Dunleary again, Willie DeMange, who teaches music and is a fine player. And other people, Philip Brennix was our keyboard player, and his brother, I think, does film, big, very...
Yeah. Stephen Rennox.
Yeah.
Just incredible soundtracks.
Yeah. So again, so it's just who was available and close by, and as I said, there were different times too as well. No internet, you know, like there were different times you'd spend a lot of time on the phone, you know. Kieran was great. Kieran always made stuff happen, and we had a good team.
Yeah. Obviously, everyone knows U2 stayed at home. Before that, all the bands had to emigrate. If you wanted a career as a musician, you had to leave this poor country. And you know, Trevor being in Amsterdam is really interesting. But you were one of the first bands, along with U2, that were able to stay at home. Did that influence the way you thought about music? Would you have been a different band if you'd got the record deal and moved to Hounslow? Like, was there?
There was some, I know what you mean, Hounslow, but would we have been, there is something magic about London and always has been. It is such a, you know, I think it's hard to answer. I've seen some people that had to go to London to make it up. I know Irish bands. I remember Micro Disney went there, great, you know, and yeah, so would we have, it might have done us good in some ways to get, but I suppose we were one of the fortunate ones to get a record deal around that time. There were a few other Dublin bands. There was Cactus and Cactus World News and Into and Nua, and I'm just trying to think of the other bands that got that. And I think it might have been on the back of the U2 success. There were a lot of, and there were different times. There was more money. I guess there were A&R people at gigs and.
Yeah, but you were slightly ahead of those bands, you know. As I remember, you know, you were making music, doing gigs before they played. Couple of things. We're in a record shop. So where were you buying your records back in the day?
Where was I buying my records? I'm just trying to think. Pat Egan's Sound Cellar is my earliest memory.
Amazing.
But then probably Murray's on Grafton Street. Actually, and another guy I worked with later used to work there, who was in a band called the Hellfire Club, a small Tom Doyle.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, he was like the most handsome guy in Dublin, you know, and he worked in there, and I remember they had all those early, like the first Cure singles stuck to the wall in coloured vinyl, and Gang of Four, and that you know, early Rough Trade, and I think Maurice was a good spot there, I guess. Those two places, holidays to London, scouring the record shops.
Okay, now that's really important. So, was that before you started the band?
All during that period. I lived in Dunleary. We had the boat. Yeah. I'd go to London regularly to buy some records or a leather jacket or something.
Yeah.
You know.
And would you go to gigs, or was it just buying
I was
records?
a bit younger then
Yeah.
when I started, and not so much gigs.
Yeah.
I did see, I saw a few great gigs in London various times around then, but not regularly. But no, it was always a bit of a draw. London, it was very exciting coming from Ireland. you
Yeah,
know.
and it's important to calculate that, but so many Irish people, because records were really expensive in this country, because we had VAT on them. So anyone who has a record collection that lived here, and someone in England who has the same record collection, the person in England didn't pay probably 75% of what we had to. So the amount of records bought in Ireland, you know, by Irish people in England and then brought over on the B&I, you know, must really have perverted the British chart.
Just come to be Camden Town, wasn't that a real, wasn't there like
Yeah,
a
for
load,
bootleg
for
tapes,
reggae
yeah.
and punk and different,
Okay,
a real markety kind of.
yeah. So you opened for really, really big acts. You know, got the major record deal, and you've mentioned that there were attractive men, other attractive men in your band. Was Jim Core
Oh, Jim.
in your
Oh,
band
so
before
we're-
he thought, well, maybe my sisters would sell more records than these people from Dunleary?
So we're up to album 2. So first album,
Yeah.
then that one, 85, 86, Slane. We toured America then.
Yeah.
As kind of a college tour. That thing, the early days of college radio. Did, again, amazing first time on the bus, 5 Irish lads, and a lot of small gigs, some supports to bigger acts, and kind of clubs, college radio, all that kind of thing. And so that was the kind of end and the highlight of that. Then it was into album 2. We made album 2 then in Bath in England. It was The Voice of Reason, and again, that was probably influenced by the touring in America. So I think somewhere in my head, we have to make the album more American sounding. So it was probably not one of my, well, it's fine, it's still, you know, but maybe that had some influence on the sound. Yeah, so we made that record, and when it came to tour that record, we were getting a band together, and we came across Jim Core, and I forget exactly how, but I remember his parents coming to with the 3 sisters and Jim, because the girls were young. We're talking 87, and all the band had to behave themselves. Needless to say, Jim, introduce me to your sisters. And the mother, actually, you can see the mother was the nicest. His parents, the mother was just the most lovely lady, and pretty. Where they all got, you can see where it came from. So, but anyway, yes. So we came across Jim, and Jim. He was a different guy. He was quiet. He was so quiet, and just, you know, I remember me and Steve. We'd often have to share a room when we're on tour. And the hotel, the door would bang, you know, so like 2 a.m, we just had our beers and we're in bed. And Jim say, "Hey, what's going on? You know, what's going on?" He says, "Everyone's gone to bed, Jim." And it's over, the party's over, you know. But he was quite the first thing I noticed about him, they were so musical. They were a really musical bunch. It was just in them. I remember Jim, the first time I heard him just tinkling on a piano, and he was just such a lovely touch on the piano. So, yeah, and then the chords, of course, you know, became a big, super successful pop band, and
They became the Fountainhead that we exported.
Actually, I did catch him once. I remember looking over my shoulder, and he was. And I said, "Stop that! Yeah, no clapping on stage."
So he was ready. He was ready. He was waiting for his next band. Fantastic. Again, you know, when you look at the histories that have been written about the Irish music industry, like, you know, I do think that Alta the Fay and the Fountainhead, you know, aren't as prominent as they should be. You're almost too early for what then became, I think, the post U2 history. It was as if nothing had happened before then. So, you know, as a fan of both of your bands, it was such a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Neil, for this is such a beautiful room. So thank you very much.
It's lovely. It's really, it's a lovely room. It's my first time here, so it's really nice. I'd imagine a few small gigs down here might be in order.
Great. They've begun. So thank you very much to Pat O'Donnell.